Problem 24-27A asks you to calculate overhead allocation using a single rate plant-wide system for an organization, and then also the ABC overhead allocation, and to do a comparison of the two to see how the pricing of our products would differ using the two different overhead allocation systems. So we have Crescent Pharmaceutical, who's manufacturing some allergy medication. They are selling, we have two different types of products, and so we want to identify whether those two different types of products require different amounts of overhead, and we will see that they do. We have 1,000 capsules that we're bottling containers with 1,000 capsules for large healthcare organizations, but then we have small travel packs of 20 capsules that we're shipping out to shops and airports, train stations, hotels. So we have the following information. The organization has reviewed their financials, and they have identified $427,500 worth of overhead or indirect cost. They have broken these costs down into three different overhead cost pools, one for quality assurance, one for packaging, and one for materials handling. As a result, of these three different cost pools, they have also identified three different allocation bases for these products. So the number of kilos being moved impacts materials handling, the number of machine hours is driving packaging, and the number of samples generated is driving quality assurance. So remember, we're simply saying that the more samples we produce, the more overhead we're generating in quality assurance. The more machine hours we run, the more overhead we generate in packaging. Okay, so we've estimated our cost pools, we've estimated our cost drivers. So the next thing that your text provides us is the actual information about our product. We actually produced 4,000 commercial containers and 54,000 travel packs. We have the drivers for each one of those, weight in kilos, machine hours, and number of samples. Okay, so if we follow through with our assignment here, it asks us to calculate the predetermined overhead rate for each activity, materials, packaging, and quality assurance. And then it asks us to compute the activity-based cost per unit for each of these different products. Then we will look at our overhead allocation rate using a single plant-wide overhead allocation rate of $153 per machine hour. So once we've done those calculations, we'll take a look at how our price per unit actually varies depending on the method of allocation that we're using for overhead. So if we begin with the ABC method in requirement 1, remember our overhead allocation rate is simply what is our total estimated overhead cost and what is our estimated overhead driver or base. Your book told us the estimated overhead for materials, packaging, and quality assurance. They gave us the estimated drivers, 24,000 kilos, 44,140 machine hours, and 2,075 estimated samples. So what we can now we can calculate this predetermined overhead allocation rate. And what we're saying is that for every kilo that we move, it is costing us $4 in overhead in the materials handling department. For every machine hour that I run, I incur $50 of overhead in packaging. For every sample that I generate, I incur $60 of overhead in quality assurance. Be sure you understand what these rates actually tell us about our organization. So once I have those rates, 4, 50, and 60, now I can calculate the overhead cost for each container, for each product per se. So with the commercial containers that had a large amount of allergy medication in them, we simply take our overhead rate times the actual number of kilos that we used to produce this product. So in this case, we have $56,000 of overhead. For the packaging, it was $50 per machine hour. We actually used 3,000 machine hours. So I should have incurred $150,000 worth of overhead. With my samples, it was $60 per sample, and we generated 400. So I should have incurred around $24,000 of overhead from the quality assurance department. So if we add this up, what we have is our total overhead allocated to this product from materials, packaging, and quality assurance. So if we take our total overhead, estimated overhead, and we divide it by the number of units that we actually produced, then we have an activity-based cost per unit of $57.50 for overhead. All right, if we do the same thing for travel packs, the same overhead allocation rates apply. It's simply now the drivers are different, where we had 14,000 kilos above, because remember we're moving much larger packages. We only have 5,400 kilos here. Where we had 3,000 machine hours in packaging, we only have 540 with our smaller packets. And with 400 samples in the large batches, we actually had 810 in the smaller batches. So once again, we calculate our overhead using these overhead application rates and the actual amount of our cost drivers. So now I've estimated $97,200 worth of overhead for the travel packs divided by the number of packs that we actually produced, and my activity-based cost per unit here is $1.80. So if we do the same process now for a single plant-wide overhead rate of $153 per machine hour, we're simply saying we're not separating out what's taking place in materials handling, packaging, and quality assurance. We're simply deciding that all of our overhead is driven by these machine hours. Where in ABC costing, we said only packaging was being driven by machine hours. So if we use this single rate and we multiply the rate times 3,000 machine hours for our commercial, 540 machine hours for our travel packs, now we generate total overhead divided by the number of units produced, $114.75 compared to $1.53. So if we do a comparison now between what was the overhead allocation based on my traditional system versus overhead allocation with ABC, we can see that I have allocated way too much overhead to my commercial containers using the single plant-wide rate. Actually, $57.25 too much overhead to each container. And in my travel packs, I've actually would underestimate the amount of overhead at $153 compared to $1.80. Now, if travel packs were all we were manufacturing, would 27 cents per pack be significant? Possibly. Okay, it depends on what our price point is for this product. But what we can see in this comparison is the more precise cost pools that we develop and the more precise cost drivers that we develop, the more precisely we can allocate manufacturing overhead. And this problem is a prime example of that. The traditional costing system overcost the overhead for our commercial containers, and a slight underpricing of the travel packs. And this is because the traditional costing system doesn't really reflect the way that the two products are actually using our resources or our overhead in the manufacturing process like the ABC system does. Once again, it's a cost-benefit decision. How cost beneficial is it for your organization to track 3, 4, 5, 10 cost pools and drivers versus one cost pool and driver? And that's a decision that you have to make as the manager of an organization. But certainly, the more detailed that your cost pools can be and the more detailed that your cost drivers can be, the more precise your overhead estimations are going to be when you're allocating overhead to the manufacturing process.